It is the year 1406 BC, and Israel spent the last 40 years in the desert. We're nearing the end of that 40-year period in the wilderness. We're in Numbers 24, 14 through 25 tonight. Israel's a rebellious nation, but now they've kind of transitioned into this people that are ready to inherit the promised land, and they're across the Jordan, waiting to take what God has promised them. And just to kind of show you a little bit about where they are, here's Jericho, and Israel is over in this general area. Okay, they're not far from Mount Nebo. They're in the plains opposite the Jordan River, across from Jericho. So something like that. Well, anyway, they're ready. They're ready to inherit the promised land. It hasn't been easy. There have been obstacles every step of the way. The nations around them have continued to come against them, fight against them, but Israel's defeated all these enemies in the Transjordan area. And we've talked about that Transjordan. I've shown you on the map. Everything east of the Jordan is the Transjordan. It's the other side from the promised land, the other side of the Jordan. And now Balak, the king of Moab, Balak wants to come against Israel. And again, just to kind of show you where these guys are, from the Arnon to the Zered rivers, Moab is basically, they've been forced down into this land from the Amorites, okay? And not the Ammonites, the Amorites. The Amorites had kind of dwelt this whole region, and now Israel's in control of that. But the Amorites had moved Moab down, so Moab is down in this area, okay, and Israel's kind of in all of this space. Well, Moab wants to fight against them, and it's interesting because today the Palestinians don't recognize Israel's right to exist as a nation. Well, this is 3,500 years ago. This is really creeping up on 1406 BC. So that's, I don't know, 3,425 years? 3,425 years? 3,425 years ago, the people of the surrounding region did not consider Israel, did not see Israel as having a right to exist as a nation. Nothing has really changed over nearly 4,000 years of human history. The modern people, the modern Palestinians, don't recognize Israel's right to exist. The Amorites, the Moabites, the Edomites, all the peoples of the land, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and so on. These guys didn't recognize Israel's right to exist as a nation either. And so King Balak, the king of Moab, he gathers up support against Israel. He gathers up the Midianites, okay, and he wants to support the gods as well. And so he sends messengers far and wide, 400 miles away, to Balaam the seer. But Balaam has made it clear that he would only speak what God said. And instead of cursing Israel, Balaam blesses Israel. He's blessed them 3 times. And each time Balaam blesses Israel, King Balak, the king of Moab, is getting more and more angry. But Balaam's blessings, what we looked at last week, Balaam's blessings make it clear that God favors Israel. God favors Israel. God's hand of blessing is upon Israel. They are his people. This morning, I was reading. I read 2 Timothy, and then I read I don't know, a handful of chapters in Jeremiah, and one of those chapters was Jeremiah 31. And in Jeremiah 31, you see that God's purpose is to bless Israel, and that even the new covenant is for Israel. We're along for the ride. We get to participate in the blessings, but the new covenant that's fulfilled in Jesus' millennial kingdom is with Israel. God has a special relationship with Israel as his people. And the blessings of Balaam make it clear that Moab should not fight with Israel. And they make it clear that God will keep those promises to Israel. Today is no different. Today expands upon that. Balaam isn't quite done yet with blessing Israel. He has more to say to bless Israel. He has one final oracle left. And that's what we're going to look at today. And it's a little surprising. It's a little surprising to read his words. We're going to look at verse 14. And I'm just going to kind of bring it up in my text here. I don't know if that's going to be big enough for you yet. So let me bring it up in this other text. Verse 14. And now, Balaam is speaking here to King Balak of Moab. And now, behold, I am going to my people. Come, and I will advise you what this people will do to your people in the days to come. So Balaam is going to tell King Balak a little bit about what's coming in the future. It's a shadow of what's going to come. And notice how Balaam starts his oracle in verse 15 with this customary introduction. Now, this is where I think I could kind of bring you over to my document, and I can probably make that a little larger. He took up his discourse and said, let's see if I get it even bigger. Hopefully that's big enough for you guys. The oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor. Now what I'm doing here, I've kind of color-coded things and just kind of identifying like the parallel ideas. I'm not going to go through that in great detail tonight. Not quite as much as I was going through it last week, but just kind of show you how I look at these types of things, how I look at passages and try to identify structure and that type of stuff. The oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, and the oracle of the man whose eye is open. So you can kind of see where the ideas are parallel. That's supposed to be my drawing. Sorry, this program's not quite as good as the other one. So each of these is a repetition of the oracle, and each of the red items here are really just another way of saying Balaam, right? The oracle of Balaam. It's like this like a thrice repeated idea here. The oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, and the oracle of the man whose eye is opened. The oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered. You have this several descriptions of Balaam, the one whose eyes opened, one who hears the word of God, who knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down before him, who has his eyes uncovered. What I find interesting here, and it's hard, it stands out. Well, before I really get there, the oracle of the man whose eye is open there at the end of verse 15, kind of that first one I have underlined there. This is a phrase that Balaam's already used in the last oracle in Numbers 24, verses 2 through 3. He's already used this very phrase. And it wasn't long ago that when Balaam was tempted to take the riches that were being offered to him by Balak, the king of Moab, it wasn't long ago when Balaam lapsed in judgment, when he dreamed that a life of riches could be his, when he loved, as Peter wrote, when he loved the wages of unrighteousness, and he'll love those wages again. It wasn't long ago when Balaam's spiritual blindness was clear and obvious. I mean, his own donkey could see better than he could see. Remember, the donkey could see the angel of the Lord, but Balaam, the seer, was blind to it, and the donkey saved his life. Balaam claims to have heard the words of God, which he did hear the words of God. He claims to know the knowledge of the Most High. He has this experience. He's had this experience with the Most High God. He's seen the vision of the Almighty God. He's heard the words of the Most High, and the appropriate response was that he fell down before him. Now, Balaam's not giving his opinions here. He's heard what God has said. He's been in the presence of the Almighty God of heaven. What stands out to me in this little list of descriptions of Balaam is how Balaam starts a description of himself, though, as the man whose eye is opened, and he ends the description of himself as one who has his eyes uncovered. And these two ideas are the same. For those of you who like structure, this can be called. I know Matt and Jill. I know you guys are a little more into poetry. You guys, perhaps Jill, you even understand poetry quite a bit more than I do. I'm not the biggest poetry person, but this is called. Oh, what's going on here? I'm trying to draw. This is called, and I'm trying to write this real neat. Inclusio. If you type that into your computer is going to spell check that and put inclusion. It's going to add an N to it every single time. Okay, and I know that from experience. Just telling you. So, but this is like a formula. It's two bookends on a shelf. I don't usually use that word, but it starts the same way it finishes, and that and in the way I'm seeing this kind of little introduction is that's the thing that Balaam's really highlighting here. Okay, his eyes have been opened. This is why his eyes have been opened. And since these things happened, his eyes have been opened. It's like, I finally get it. I finally see. And in this moment, Balaam finally understands what God wants. So again, not the strongest person when it comes to poetry, but this one here is almost undeniable in my eyes. I can't see it any other way. So Balaam kind of introduces his oracle, and then he makes a pronouncement. He pronounces judgment against Moab and against Edom, nations who had set themselves against Israel, in verse 17. Verse 17, I see him. Now, before we kind of get to that judgment, just bear with me a little bit. I see him, but not now. I'll pull 17 up to the top of the screen for you. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. And you could really see, you could really see how these two verses parallel each other, right? How these two ideas are basically the same. These two ideas are basically the same. I color-coded that just to help you see the structure a little bit. Again, I'm not going to go through that in any kind of detail. Balaam sees a figure, but not now. That is this figure that Balaam sees, okay? He's seeing a figure from a future time, a figure who's at least removed from his current time. And we know that Balaam said, let me tell you about things that will come. Balaam's talking about a future person, a future being, and the distant future, not something that necessarily would happen tomorrow, but it's something that Balaam sees this person. It's not a person of our time. He sees this person. It's not a person that's even near our time. It's out in the future. It's out in the distant future. And who this figure is very interesting, even unexpected. Something that, I read this passage. I've read this passage. I don't know, before I studied this, maybe 20 or 30 times. And it just never really stood out to me, or maybe it did and I forgot. But notice how Balaam describes this person, this one that he sees, this one that he beholds. Verse 17, a star shall come forth from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel. And again, you'll see that parallel. And again, these two lines, it's just emphasis. A star, a scepter, right? We don't know for sure, like beyond a shadow of a doubt, although I would think I'm going to make a pretty good argument for it, but this seems to be a messianic prophecy. That is, this seems to be talking about a future Messiah in Israel. Balaam, the pagan prophet, is prophesying about a messianic king who will rule over the nations. And we understand that Messiah to be Jesus Christ. Look at the language it's used. A star shall come forth from Jacob. Now, listen to what Jesus says about himself. Let me go ahead and pull you over there. Revelation 22:16. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you these things for the churches. I am the root and descendant of David, the bright morning star. And here, 1,400 years or so before that's even written, Balaam prophesies of a star that would come forth from Jacob. Notice what else Balaam says about this person, that a scepter shall rise. A scepter shall rise from Israel. Again, that's kind of in this little couplet, these two parallel lines, okay? A scepter is something that a king holds. It's a symbol of power and authority, as one guy writes. It signifies that a person's a ruler. And so we know this is talking about a king. Okay, this is talking about a king. Now, when Jacob's blessing his 12 sons on his deathbed, we're going back several hundred years. When Jacob is blessing his 12 sons on his deathbed, he uses the same word. Check this out. Sorry, I'm switching between two programs. It's a little obtuse. Genesis 49:10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. This is at least, this statement of Jacob, which talks about a scepter not departing, is at least a reference to a Davidic dynasty. I was talking about D.A. Carson this morning. I referenced D.A. Carson calls it a dynasty. The Davidic dynasty. I guess that's maybe, I don't know, British or something. But the Davidic dynasty, that is the rule of the kings through David. And the language is that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. That the kings will come from Judah. The Messiah will come from Judah. And there's debate over what this phrase, until Shiloh comes, means. And I've argued that this is ultimately a reference to the Messiah. And if you're interested in that argument, I'm not going to go through that tonight for sake of time. But if you're interested in that argument, we have a message on this passage where I kind of go in that a little bit. But let's imagine that this is a reference to a human king. All right. Now, Saul, we'll go back to this king. To him shall be the obedience of the peoples, right? And when we go to Balaam's passage, a scepter shall rise from Israel. A star shall come forth from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel, and shall crush through the forehead of Moab and tear down all the sons of Sheth. Now, we're seeing dominion here. We're seeing dominion over the area. Saul never really had that dominion. Saul was fighting to centralize his government. He was fighting to really get rid of the enemies. Okay, just to gain the power in the area, just to gather the 12 tribes together. David was fighting his whole life with the surrounding nations. Under Solomon's rule, Israel held most of the area. And so you could perhaps make the argument that this star, this scepter, could be a reference to David or Solomon, maybe. But we also know that David's rule is everlasting. And check this out. Or when I say David's rule, of course I'm talking about the dynasty of David. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. 2 Samuel 7:16. Your throne shall be established forever. This ultimately happens through the Messiah. And maybe Solomon gathers up some area, some of the local area, some of the region under his power. But we know what happens with Solomon. Solomon, he multiplies wives, he multiplies horses, he multiplies gods, right? And ultimately, that kingdom is going to see destruction at some point by around 586 BC. This everlasting rule is a reference to the eternal rule of the Messiah. This is talking about the Messiah. Balaam is talking about a coming king in Israel, and this coming king will crush the nations around him. He shall crush through the forehead of Moab, tear down all the sons of Sheth. This king is ultimately a reference to Jesus Christ. When he comes back, he'll destroy his enemies with the sword of his mouth, Revelation 19, verses 11 through 19. And when he comes back, he'll rule for 1,000 years and for all eternity. And that will be a fulfillment of God's promises of a new covenant to the people of Israel. This king crushes the forehead of Moab. He'll destroy Moab. Remember, Moab set themselves against the people of God. He'll tear down the sons of Sheth. These people have set themselves against the Lord. By the way, Moab comes from the line of Seth. It comes through incest from Lot, and so this is just two ways of talking about the people of Moab and similar peoples. So this future king, this star, this scepter, who will come forth, who will rise like this meteoric rise, right? And he'll tear down his foes. Notice what he'll do with Edom in verses 18 and 19. Verse 18, Edom shall be a possession. Seir, its enemies, also will be a possession, while Israel performs valiantly. One from Jacob shall have dominion. I put a little note there. And if you don't understand that note, that's as much for me as for anyone. Basically, you'll see we have a blue line, blue and red, right? And there's no red over here, right? And that's because whereas in English it looks like this dominion should be red, it's in the original language it's just part of the verb. So there is no red section over there. There's kind of like this. It doesn't parallel the rest of this stuff. But that's just how even poetry or writing, there are rules, but those rules and in Hebrew there's rules. There's all types of rules you learn in Hebrew, but almost every one of those rules gets broken all the time. So and that's true. I speak American, right? That's true in English. We have all types of rules, but we break all types of those grammar rules get broken all the time. So that little note there, the verb of being, that's for me more than it is for you. You could just ignore it. Edom shall be a possession. Seir, its enemies, and Seir is a mountain within the land of Edom. Its enemies will also be a possession, while Israel performs valiantly. One from Jacob shall have dominion and will destroy the remnant from the city. Israel will conquer Edom. Now, just to kind of show you a little bit again here on the map, if I get you the right one. Let me take a second. A lot of programs run at the same time. The Edomites were down here, but below the Dead Sea. You might remember Israel wanted to kind of pass up through and go to go through their land. And the Edomites said, nope, you can't go. You can't come this way. And if we were to zoom out, we're going to remember that Israel had to go all the way down, 90 miles south, 20 miles east, 90 miles north, just to get around the people of Edom. What a drag, months and months of travel, because these Edomites had set themselves against God. You'll see the Edomites at the bottom of this map too. You just kind of find them here. right in the south of the Dead Sea area. They kind of control this region, and you can't really get past there. And one of the nice things is, you know, if you control the king's highway, then anytime people want to travel through their land, you know, they would tax them. They would give it. It's kind of like a toll system. Well, anyway, these guys had set themselves against Israel, and they refused to allow Israel to travel through that land and forced Israel to go 200 miles out of their way. Edom would pay for their lack of vision. And this future king of Israel shall have dominion. In verse 19, the one from Jacob, shall have dominion. Again, we know that the Messiah will have perfect dominion. Daniel's going to later write about his rule. Check this out. Daniel 7:13 through 14. This is one that should kind of be like like a broken record type passage. Okay, this is a passage that we should know, and we should know well. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of the Days and was presented before him. So this one, like unto a son of man, this is talking about the Messiah. He came up to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him, and to this one who was like unto a son of man, to this one who was able to get in the presence of the Almighty, to him was given, there's that word, dominion. We talked about this on Wednesday night a couple of weeks ago. To him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. And so when we look at a passage like this, and we see that dominion that Daniel would write of, and we see here, one from Jacob shall have dominion down in verse 19, we see the beginnings of a theme, or the continuing of a theme that the prophets will write about. Balaam, whether he knows it or not, Balaam is talking about Messiah. Isaiah is going to write about this king in Isaiah 9, and this is another one of those passages you guys should know very well. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest upon his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on forevermore. The Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So Balaam talks about this one who would have dominion. Daniel writes about him. Isaiah writes about him. Luke the physician, writes about him in the New Testament. And Luke 1:32 through 33. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. He will have a throne, a scepter. And he will reign. He will have dominion over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. So Balaam, a pagan prophet, is telling of this future king in 1406 BC, almost 1,500 years before he comes. That's pretty cool. I think it's pretty cool. Usually I just kind of pass by that type of stuff. I don't really think a whole lot about it. That's pretty awesome that God would use the mouth of a donkey to wake this guy up. And he would use the mouth of a fool who was so foolish that he was more foolish than a donkey to prophesy of the coming Messiah. Which goes to show you God can use anybody, even fools. But Balaam tells of a coming king. He tells of the future destruction of Moab and Edom at the hands of this king. And he continues that oracle, telling of the future of Amalek and the Kenites. Now, I won't spend a whole lot of time here. I will probably tell you a little bit about these people, just a tiny bit. But notice what he says about the people of Amalek in verse 20. And he looked at Amalek and took up his discourse and said, Amalek was the first of the nations, but his end shall be destruction. The Amalekites were the first enemies that Israel faced. You might remember that they ruthlessly attacked Israel in the desert. And you would see them down in the Negev area of this map, the Amalekites. They would be over a general range of areas, but you might remember what God said about these people. Listen to this. Well, you know what? Let's turn there. Exodus 17:15. Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." And he said, the Lord has sworn the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. The Amalekites attacked Israel when they were in the desert. They attacked Israel again when the rebels rejected the promised land in chapter 14, Numbers 14, verses 43 through 45. King Saul would be told in 1 Samuel 15 to wipe out the Amalekites. Of course, he didn't want to kill its king or the spoils of war. And so Samuel hacked King Agag to pieces. But we're seeing a continuation of these people as enemies of Israel. King David fought against the Amalekites later on in 1 Samuel 30, when they had kind of taken the city of Ziklag. King Hezekiah would fight against these guys in the 700s. And so these Amalekites are perpetual enemies of Israel, and they're also enemies of God. Consequently, they'd be destroyed by this future king. And that's kind of a little bit of the language we're seeing here. He looked at Amalek and took up his discourse and said, Amalek was the first of the nations, but his end shall be destruction. His end shall be destruction. And Israel will destroy the Amalekites, and Israel will destroy the Kenites. Verses 21, 22. And he looked at the Kenite and took up his discourse and said, your dwelling place is enduring, and your nest is set in the cliff. You've got this nestled area in the hills, high up and protected. Nevertheless, Cain, just another word here for the Kenites, will be consumed. How long will Asher keep you captive? Asher is a reference to the Assyrians. I'll tell you about them in a minute. I won't spend a lot of time there. But Balaam tells of this coming king, a shadow of the Messiah. He tells of future destruction of Moab, of Edom, of Amalek, of the Kenites. And he finishes his oracle by lifting up the Lord in verses 23 through 24. Then he took up his discourse and said, alas, who can live except God has ordained it? But ships shall come, that is the Messiah, and these people, Israel, under his rule, will dominate the entire region, and everyone will answer to the Lord. Everyone. Balaam here recognizes God's perfect sovereignty. He is the giver of life. Without him, none of us would survive. This is a reference to the region and their survival under Messiah, but we can extend that beyond that. God has perfect sovereignty over all of life. We know this to be true. Life is the first gift, the gift of gifts, and God bestows it upon whom he will, and he takes it from whom he will. And this Messiah here, who will rule this region, will rule far and wide. Verse 24. But ships shall come from the coasts of Kittim. Kittim is let me show you the map. The map's not going to show it as Kittim, but it's another word for Cyprus. Here we go. Sorry about that. Computer's a little slow today. Kittim is a reference to the sea-bearing peoples of Cyprus. All right. And so the ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, and they shall afflict Asher. By New Testament times, Kittim would be understood not only as the island of Cyprus, but of any of the sea-bearing peoples, like the peoples of Crete or the people of Greece, or even out here, the people of Rome, any Western sea-bearing nation. Ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, and they shall afflict Asher. They shall afflict Assyria, and Eber will go in here. Sorry. And will afflict Eber, so they also will come to destruction. Asher is Assyria, and in case you're not familiar with those people, you go back. We're going to have this online later if you want. Assyria, this is the height of Assyrian rule. They ruled the entire Fertile Crescent. In the Fertile Crescent, basically you have the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers coming up here, Tigris, and all the area around those rivers was fertile. It was known as the Fertile Crescent. The Assyrians would dominate this whole region, and they would come down and they would take the northern kingdom of Israel and deport those people in 722 BC. They wouldn't hear the prophets of the Lord, and so they were taken away. And they actually came down against the southern kingdom of Judah around 725 BC. Actually, it was a little after that. But they would have perhaps defeated them if one, if obviously it wasn't for the Lord, but two, a brilliant move by Hezekiah the king. Hezekiah knows these guys are coming, and he diverts the water so that by the time the Assyrians show up, there's no water for those guys. He diverted all the water into the city. I thought you'd think this. I thought you'd like this. So I'll show you. He diverted all the water down here, so that the water was inside the walls of the city, and they gathered together down at a pool way down at the bottom of this picture. That's the pool of Siloam, and this is kind of like a drawing of what that would have looked like. That's actually a mural that's there on that site. I took this picture on that site. There's no water. There's some water or a pool like that there today, but that pool that you're looking at stopped this ancient superpower of Assyria from taking the city of Jerusalem. Anyway, sorry about that. That was kind of an aside. But Balaam speaks about Eber's destruction. We don't know much about Eber. People have debated who these people are for some time. William F. Albright sees these people as nomads. Some think they're related to Assyria. I don't know. Whatever the case is, they're related. They're going to come to destruction. All these people are going to come to destruction because you cannot stand against God's people. And you cannot stand against God. And all the enemies of Israel will ultimately be destroyed. This is part of the reason, by the way, this is part of the reason why it's so important for us to have good relations with Israel. In the last decade or so, our relations with Israel have been strained. Our last president, President Barack Obama, he had a horrible, horrible relationship with Israel. He was probably the worst, the absolute worst president we've ever had in how we've dealt with Israel. Probably one of the worst, if not the worst. Our current president, Donald Trump, has probably been the best friend Israel's had since they've been an organized nation. The best friend Israel's had in the White House, the current president. One of the best friends. It's almost baffling to me because I look at Donald Trump and I'm like, ethically, I've got questions about him. I wanted him to step down before the election because of ethical reasons, and he's been one of the best friends Christianity's had, and he's been one of the best friends Israel's had. So one day, though, one day America is going to become an enemy of Israel. We could read about that in Revelation. Now it's not going to list America, but all the nations are going to come against Israel. And one day we're going to join those nations in opposition to Israel. One day we're going to be the bad guys. And it's becoming easier to see how that could happen, especially right now. It's becoming easier to see how that could happen with the rise of Marxism and movements like Black Lives Matter that are Marxist movements that have kind of deceived people into thinking if you don't believe Black Lives Matter, then you're a racist. Well, it's just deception is all it is. It's a Marxist group, and they want to destroy our way of life. One day America is going to be destroyed with the nations. One day we're going to be the bad guy. That's fact. Keep that in mind when you're tempted to become overly zealous as an American nationalistic patriot. Keep that in mind. Anyway, Balaam's mentioned the destruction of the surrounding nations, the enemies of Israel. Much of that is accomplished during the time of Solomon and during the time of David, but ultimately it happens when Jesus Christ comes back at the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation 19:11 and following. And so Balaam gives his oracle of the future glory of Israel, the future glory of its messianic king, and the future destruction of all of Israel's enemies. And then Balaam leaves. Look at, then Balaam arose and departed and returned to his place, and Balak also went his way. What a glorious, victorious moment for Balaam, the pagan prophet. Of course, it'll be short-lived. Balaam's going to begin his 400 miles back to the city of Pethor, but he'll never make it back. He'll give advice on how to cause Israel to fall. We could read about that in Numbers 31, and we will read about that. He'll advise King Balak about how to tempt the men of Israel with their cult prostitutes, with Moab's cult prostitutes. And Balaam will eventually die at the hands of Israel. And so the seer who blesses Israel these 4 times ultimately brings trouble upon them and brings his own destruction. You think that after a prophecy like this, you think you'd know better. It's a sad, sad state of affairs for this once victorious seer. In this passage, we see the futility, the uselessness, the utter uselessness of opposing God. Anyone who sets themselves against God's people will be destroyed. This should serve as a warning to anyone who claims to accept the Bible as God's word. I cannot understand how believers can support any politician who is not supportive of the nation of Israel. They're setting themselves against God. They are. And so we see the futility, the uselessness of opposing God, opposing God's people. We also see the sovereign rule of the Lord and of his Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah, and he will rule for all eternity. And one day, every knee will bow before him in heaven and on earth. We're called to place ourselves beneath him. We need to recognize that we're in trouble with God. We need to recognize we can't fix the situation. We need to place our faith in the completed work of Christ on the cross. And when we do that, we have a new, more glorious citizenship, not as an American, but as a citizen of heaven. And we have a more glorious patriotism, not as Americans, but as part of the family of God, as Christians. In our day, I'm constantly reminding believers, the difference between an American right and what God says. Sometimes I think we get those things confused a little bit, especially in our patriotism. My patriotism is tempered by my Christianity. My loyalties lie with God. My loyalties lie with Jesus Christ. My loyalties lie with the church. And then they lie with my country. Well, they lie with my family before they lie with my country. So my American patriotism is maybe secondary or tertiary or further down the list. And that's appropriate, biblically speaking, because the Lord is King. And he will rule over all the earth. That is where our loyalties should lie. And so let us therefore submit to his rule. And when we do that, we will be partakers of his promises to Israel.